This is the Digital Formula Podcast, a show about digital transformations, why they fail, and how you can apply the formula to ensure that your transformation program will create the expected results. By aligning your services to your strategy, architect solutions well, and deliver them in an agile fashion.
Okay, everyone, we're back. In this second part, we'd like to give you some real overview and a takeaway about what it means to apply business intelligence and analytics and kind of focus on process mining. So, most of you already have business intelligence capabilities. Everyone's had some sort of business warehouse, whether that's just a database with a few different views or a more complex analysis engine, Cognos and so on, to do those analysis capabilities, execution and automation of processes, those kinds of things. Folks have always had some combination of them. But the question is, are different groups able to use that information to work together more effectively to have better outcomes? Mm-hmm. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask focusing on process mining, we're going to kind of ask, what are the skills or standard technologies that you have in-house already, and how can process mining help, and how can you get started? So Roland's going to walk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, and you mentioned it, I think organizations have a big majority of the building blocks already in-house. You run, I haven't seen an organization that ran their business on a paper ledger, right? So you have runtime systems that create data, right? So you have events. Oh, this PO was created by this person on that date and time and whatnot, right? And it has a PO number, right? So there are things that you already have. Then you already might have people who have the technical chops to create the integration that you might or might not need. By the way, I do not recommend to do this in your very first project. And then you just need to get the people together. And that sounds so easy. In my experience, it's not, because people have different thought patterns. But Mike, thanks for the introduction. So what we're proposing for mining projects is a 6-step process. And each of those 6 steps can basically, fill a whole episode, right? So take this more like an overview, not as a specific how-to that you just can follow. So the first step that you have is, in lack of a better word, and I think it's too generic, but in lack of a better word, I would call this define your strategy, right? And that has 2 components. The first one is rationalize why you want to do this. What's wrong when you think about the ellipse, the Venn diagram? What's wrong with your current analysis techniques? What's missing in your visibility, right? Why do you even want to do process mining, right? How does it fit, as Mike said earlier, how does it fit into the bigger picture? What other type of analysis do I need to do, right? And you might come to the conclusion, well, yeah, we might have a process problem, right? But just keep in mind, it's not the only problem that you might have. You might have to look at other things. And then you might have to think about, what is the criteria for a good process? And I will come back to that in the last phase. But just keep in mind, there's certain levers that you have in a process that you look at. Things like, try to be cute and have them start with a C all the time. Capacity, is your objective to create as many widgets as you can? Well, that might have an impact on another lever, cost, right? Because now you need to have more production machines and more people and whatnot. Adding more people, well, that could be a compliance thing, because people can screw up. So that's a consideration that you might have. Obviously, the more people you have, the more coordination you need. So the course of time for your process might be affected. It takes too long. You got bottlenecks. Person A doesn't talk to person B, and things just get dropped. Lastly, the customer experience. The way how you set up your process. Is it pleasant? Do people like to do this or not? Right? And no matter what decision you make, what your process might look like. I know Mike is very big on, well, can we get stuff out as quickly as possible, right? I might be more cautious and say, oh, we might want to look if we're with one leg in jail, the compliance aspect. Larry might say, no. Customer experience is the most important thing in the world. So you will have to make up your mind what a good process looks like. And when you have that, then you look for, and I highly recommend, and I know you will chime in on this very quickly, I highly recommend to start with a contained project, a contained process. It shouldn't be the least important process you look at, so it should have an impact, but you also don't want to have the big hairy beast being your first thing where you have to build 20 million integrations and whatnot. Mike, does that resonate with you?
It does. Particularly a couple things stand out from and I'm going to say an agility perspective, right? Of starting small and scaling up. So definitely start with something that'll give you some meat around it, but don't take on the huge end-to-end purchase to pay process, right? Maybe a piece of it. Right?
No, you could do that. But keep it simple, So because in my experience, so there's two schools of thought here when you do this. One is the one that one big vendor pushes, build everything, take the big one, and it takes you 6 months to get all the integrations done and then everything's automated. Versus a smaller one to say, just give me a damn export of your data in CSV format, right? And we do a quick turnaround. We do like 4 weeks, 5 weeks. So when you compare this, say you have a year, do you have more value out of 1 or 2 large projects, or do you have more value out of 10 or 12 smaller projects? Right? And obviously, I think the latter is the right thing to do because you want to build up momentum.
You want to show improvements faster, smaller improvements faster, so people can see real results coming out who are not embedded in the day-to-day on this, right?
Yep, and you want to have that momentum. People see the value and they say, oh, I want that too. Right. So my typical analogy, sorry for all non-Americans here, everybody wants to root for the Kansas City Chiefs and whatever. Back in the day, the Patriots and the Steelers and all those guys. Nobody wanted to root for the Cleveland Browns. Right. So what you want is from a perspective of your program, you want to build that momentum so that people hop on board and say, I want this too.
Right.
But once you have made that decision, then we go into the second step, right? Because process mining does not work without data, right? So what type of data do you need, right? And that also can determine which project process you choose, right? Because if you don't have the right data source, it's moot, right? So keep that in mind. So bring the IT person in, right? When you have those conversations. What you want is, and most process mining tools, there's 2 types of process mining. One is more case-oriented. The other one is object-oriented. And I don't go into many details here. All of the tools use case-oriented process mining, which I recommend to start with because it's simple. Your data needs just a couple of fields or columns in a table. So you create a table. That's the outcome. It's a case ID so that you can trace it like a purchase order number or an invoice number or whatever, so that you see all those steps can be traced back to that ID. You need an activity name, and you need ideally a start and an end timestamp, right? Mike created a PO with a PO number XYZ on August 22nd, 10:48, right? So that is a timestamp you can work with. Ideally, it would say, okay, he started to create it at 10:48, he ended at 10:49, but that's details. So what you want to do is you want to identify those sources where you get it from. Then, if you can't hold it, build an integration, or you just take the damn data and spit it out in a tabular format. And that brings us to the third step, and that is the one where you spend the most time in a process mining project. And don't let anyone else talk you out of that. It's creating your event log, right? Because now you get all those different records, hundreds of thousands. And by the way, I would recommend to take a process that has hundreds of thousands of records, right, and cases, because then you get enough variation in your result to get a meaningful analysis. So now you take that, and now you build out of that raw data that comes from different systems, you build that table that I just spoke about. And depending on which tool you choose, you might have to learn SQL or SQL-ish or Python, and that might be a bummer for a majority of our listeners. Or you can use GUI-driven tools like an Alteryx, like a KNIME, where you build the data model, which is the way that I would recommend for multiple reasons, because it's self-documenting. You can walk your stakeholders through what transformations you did and why you filtered out this at this point in time of your workflow, and so on and so forth, which is just not visible in a SQL query, right? Except you're a nerd and you're listening to this podcast here. You're tracking so far, Mike?
Yes, yeah, that does seem like the hard part. Is it's the logs will give you all kinds of data, and you extract it. Great. Now what do I do with it? How am I going to get this data organized?
And what
to
additional
insights?
And the organization is pretty clear because you need those columns, right? But what else do I need, right? So when we think about the strategy phase, what does a good process look like? You obviously look at the process that you choose. And to your UX example, well, you want to know where does it stink, right? And you build hypotheses, and you want to have your analysis that I will come to in a minute. You want to have that looking to verify or reject those hypotheses, right? For example, we think our incident management process stinks because the second level of escalation, those slackers never do their work, right? So it takes too long. So you want to see, is that true? Yes, no, right? What's going on in the second line thing? Oh, you might figure out they don't get the right information because the first line didn't put in enough information in the ticket. Who's the bad guy now, right? So what you do is in that data model thing is you try to figure out, okay, what's think with the end in mind, what's the thing that I want to analyze? What's my hypothesis and which data do I need? And then comes the fun part to transform it, and it will be multiple iterations and all that stuff. One thing that I would highly, highly recommend is once you got the data model, load it in your tool and have a validation workshop. Because clients, your stakeholders, will see people and say, no, you did something wrong. This is not my data. You screwed up in your data model. Our organization is perfect. It runs smoothly. Right, that spaghetti diagram that you're showing me, that's not us, right? And your job is then to say, oh, by the way, let's have a look. Let's pick an arbitrary case, Mike's purchase order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see how it went through the systems. And what you want is in that step, you want them to agree on that your data model is right, even though they don't like the outcome. Right? Because otherwise you always have that Damocles sword over your head where people say, that's not us. Yeah, you screwed up.
They identify with so that they challenge the overall aggregate analysis, but they would identify with a single story, right? If you tell them one story, they can be like, oh, I can get on board with what this person's doing in this context, in this case.
Yeah. Poke holes in it, because what you will see is a gazillion of variations, for example, right? Because everybody thinks, oh, we got that very straightforward process. You do step 1, 2, 3, and we're done, right? No, forget this, right? You will see tons of variations, and they all might have a reason, but you want to have the buy-in of your stakeholders to say, yeah, I don't like what I see, but I trust you that your data model is correct, right? So we need to make the decisions to change it, right? Think about the levers. I will talk about that in a minute. The other thing, that's the fourth step. So step 1 was the strategy, which process to pick. Step 2 was the extraction of the data. Step 3 was the data modeling. Step 4 is you want to create a reference model. And that might be an optional step. It's very helpful to see how the process should be done, right? And if you don't have it yet, while in the first step you create a napkin level understanding of the process, literally a napkin, boxes and arrows, where that might be the case where you do a how do I wish the process would be run in more detail diagram, right? So I'm talking about literally a BPMN diagram, right? Where you would articulate from your organization's perspective, this is how the process should be run. Because this then, and maybe you have that already, right? This then will be used in the analysis for things like a conformance check or variant analysis and all that type of stuff that I talk about in a minute. What you want to do is, and this is where I see a lot of projects not doing it, is to have a closer look at how the process should run process, how the work should be done process actually looks like. And what I've seen in the past were things like you have review steps, right, that are treated inconsistently. So have a traditional process workshop when you see those things and say, do we agree? Is that what we want to do? Well, why do you require a review at this point in time and 7 steps later you don't? And vice versa, right? Or what's the outcome of it? So polish up that reference process.
So Roland, when I first saw reference model, I interpreted it as something different, because when I see reference, I think generic off-the-shelf APQC, whatever. But what you mean in this case is really something that's more of our desired end state. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It's on the who does what when where level, right? So if you have a process hierarchy, it will be level 4 or 5, right? It's
so we're creating a reference model for our context in our organization in this case.
For the process that is in scope, yes. Yep. And okay. I use the term reference model because the tools use call it reference model, right? But yes, it's not the 30,000 foot APQC. It's the 6 inches above the ground view of that process that you want to have. And that brings us to the 5th step of that 6-step process, right? Which is the actual analysis. And there's a lot you can do. There's some slight nuances, what the tools can or cannot do. But in general, they're all relatively comparable. They do it in a different way in the form of how you build dashboards. Remember, data storytelling leads into good dashboards, and you want to tell the story of why is my hypothesis right or wrong? What have we seen? Incident management, we noticed, it's not the slackers on the 2nd level, but it's the missing information on the 1st level. Oh, and by the way, when I look at the 2nd level, there are some slackers depending on the supported product group, right? So you both were right. Right, so you want to tell that story, obviously then with the data that you see underneath by filtering and all those things. On a very, very high level, there's a couple of things that you do in that analysis. First of all, the tool will calculate KPIs for you, right? Your event log does not say, well, Mike created a PO at 10:48. And then the PO was submitted by the system to the vendor at 10:50. And that took 2 minutes, right? You don't see that. So the tools calculate, for example, times, right? The tools will also calculate frequencies, right? And show that. And you can see, and they create, typically, that's what you see when you look at a process mining tool, they create a graph of your process. Right, and you can see how the branches go away and how many cases went this way and how many cases went that way and all that type of stuff. What they also do is, and you typically look for frequencies and you look for times, right? There's a couple of more things you can do, asking you questions like, why do I have cases that, say in a procure to pay, that start with receiving an invoice? Is that now a data problem? Because we had an artificial cut and we just cut processes that were already in process? Or is it really true, right? That somebody in accounting gets an invoice. He doesn't know what the heck is that, for what, So you go back to your data model, try to verify this. Oh, what's the next step after that? And if the next step is, send it to Mike so that he creates a PO, but then you know what happened. That's a legitimate case, right? So you have that iteration there. And then there's other things like variant analysis and a ton of other things that those tools do. And we can talk about that ad nauseum. The gist is, what you want to do in that analysis phase is you don't want to just show that the process is bad. Even if you go in there and say, yep, your hypothesis, Mike, was that level 2 incident managers are slackers, right? That's great. You show the what. But what you want to figure out, the next logical question. Why? Who? Where? How? And this is a difference when I see people looking for a modeling tool, and do a proof of concept. They just want to see their stuff in the tool. That is not true with mining, right? What you want is that next level thing. The tool shows you the what, right? Hopefully with a nice story to tell. But the interesting question is then the person behind the screen to say, oh yeah, why, how, who, right? And then make those decisions. And that brings me to the last phase, right? So you did your analysis, you did your stakeholder readout, you said, just recap, data model is correct. They see the analysis, they see the big spaghetti diagram, they see their hypotheses, they see the reasons why things happen. The next step is completely outside of the tool, if you will. You need to find the opportunities. How do I improve things? Right? So you go and take from the first phase your levers of a process: cost, capacity, course of time, compliance, customer experience. And if we think hard enough, there might be a couple of others. You take those and you come up with ideas. Oh yeah, I can fix that second level incident management problem by hiring more people, right? Or firing that group, right? That's great. Hiring more people. That's a good idea, right? We see that obviously adds cost, right? If we want to avoid the cost, well, guess what? Do we see some underutilized groups there? Can we take people from that other group and train them to be the second level incident managers? You want to know, do I create a bottleneck now further downstream because I took out 10 people from that other group? So one analysis technique is using simulation, process simulation, to see what are my proposed changes that I make, and do I buy into another problem? So that's the first thing, right? Look at those opportunities, try to identify them, and look what are the impact on those levers.
It would seem that you use the levers, Roland, in the analysis process too, because I see the analysis process and opportunities being very closely tied together, right? You're trying to analyze so that you can uncover those opportunities, right?
For sure. But then you need to come up with a proposal, right? And there's two things. You need to say, hey, Mike, I recommend you hire 10 more people, right? Option 2 is, don't hire 10 more people. Take those 10 people from that other group and upskill them. They both come with different cost. They both come with different risks, right? They both come with different process implications. You might create a bottleneck if you take the internal ones, right? So what you want is you want to give people options, your stakeholder options. And one thing to look at is take those levers and say, well, if you take option 1, well, this is how the levers change, right? I literally create graphics with levers.
And this is simulation you're talking about, right? You are talking about what-if scenarios.
It's part of it. Yes, it's part of it. Simulation is one thing. The other thing that you want to have is just pure math. It's ROI calculations. Oh, if we hire those 10 people, but we increase our capacity, so we crank out 500 widgets more that we sell for $5 a piece. Now you do the math. It's $2,500, right? Maybe those $2,500 cover the cost of those 10 people, in an hour, and we make more profit, right? Simulation might or might not give you that information, but it's the second part of it. You want to find opportunities that you have a quantifiable outcome, right? So when you come up with your opportunities, which might or might not process oriented, talk about the levers and talk about a ideally quantifiable outcome. Because in my experience, if you just have the warm and fuzzies and said, oh, it would be great if we would do this, Mike would love to work in that wonderful new process, typically they don't sign off on that.
Yeah.
So that's our approach to it, to a process mining project. So let me recap it, and you will see it on the graphic, obviously, that I put to the show notes. Define strategy, extract data, create your event log, create your reference model, analyze your process, and then find the opportunities that you want to have. And that brings you to the decision, right? And then we can talk about, well, what does that mean? What does the solution architecture look like for this? Blah, 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 which is a complete different topic when we talk about portfolio management and how you do that. The one thing that's maybe like a parting thought on this topic is you should build that process, that thinking into all of your system implementations, right? You should have a component that allows you to do process mining based on every new implementation that you do. So things like, do I create the necessary data that I will be able to do this, right? Mm-hmm. Where do I track timestamps and users and whatnot, you know? And ideally, and you see that as a trend, a lot of people will have that built into their tools. So you might in your organization notice that you have process mining already in-house without knowing it. Maybe, Mike, couple of next steps that one could take, you know, if they found it interesting, what we were speaking about, you know, the definition of intelligence, the Venn diagram and the different analysis techniques and the 6 steps of a mining process. What can people do now?
I would say talk to us. So we're happy to walk you through the whole process from the selection of the right tool. And one of Roland's favorite phrases is you do the math. Hopefully we can find a tool to help you do the math, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can focus on what the outcomes are and helping to figure out and shape the analysis, right? So through that enablement, using that tool, you start with those small projects and scale up, build that momentum, get those success stories, because people are going to want to see some results, right? And really build it up so you can really start making the bigger decisions, helping folks make bigger decisions. And read about process intelligence, process mining, either on LSA Digital's blog or in the book recommendations that you'll see in the show notes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good approach. And I do have some ideas. Some of them are more academic, some are more hands-on, but I definitely will put some stuff in the show notes. The other thing is, if you have an idea which tools to use, well, take the training, right? Vendors typically have free training. This is in the majority button pushing, you know, to say, okay, the better ones have a process underneath how you do this. But at the end of the day, you get an idea of, well, is that a tool that I'd like to work with? Is it too complex? Does the tool have a good UI, a good user experience? You know, and those trainings are typically free, right? Again, they just help you button pushing, but at the end of the day, it's better than just buying something and then have to live with it.
Absolutely.
Well, and with that, I think we're coming to the end of this extra long show. Dear listeners, thanks for your attention. If you have questions, Mike and I are happy to answer all the questions that you throw at us. So don't be shy. Reach out to us. And obviously, thanks, Mike, for being part of this show today. And wishing you a happy day. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon.